So let's start solving this assignment. Let's start simple by creating an input field with a change listener and outputting the text below the input field. I'll do it in app.js, and as in the previous example, I'll leave the assignment introductions here. I'll add a horizontal line, self-closing element, as all JSX elements have to be in, well, JSX if you don't put anything in between. And there I'll now add an input element of type text, just like that, also self-closing. Now this alone doesn't do much. We of course need an onChange handler and execute some method there. So let's add a method to our app component. I'll name it input changed handler. And again, use my syntax here where I assign an arrow function to this property. There I will get this event object passed into it automatically. And then I'll want to store this in state. So we'll set up state as a property. And there I'll simply add a state named user input. The name is totally up to you. It'll be an empty string initially. And here in the input changed handler, I want to update it with set state. I'll set user input equal to the event target value, so to whatever the user entered. And I will now also set up two-way binding with that. Not only register this as a handler here, input changed handler, but also set the value equal to this state user input to always reflect the latest value in the input. And I'll split it over multiple lines to make it easier to read. Thus far, nothing special. Let's quickly check if it works. Let's also open the console log to see if we got any errors. And let me enter something here. This works. We're not done yet though. We should also output the text below the input. So I will add a paragraph below my input element here. And there I'll output some dynamic content, this state user input clearly. Let me save this too. And now let's try this again. This looks pretty good. I can see whatever I enter here below the input. The next step now is to create a new component which receives the text length, not the text, just the length as a prop. And here I suggest the name validation component. So I will do this. I'll create a new folder for it, validation component, and add the validation component.javascript file in there. Now, I mentioned in the problem video that you won't need state in here. So there's no need to use class and extend component. We can instead use a function again. I'll name it validation here. And I will I want to rename the name though. Validation, not validation component. This is Angular style, which we're not using here. So just validation is the name of the component without component. Still, execute a constant here where I assign a ES6 function. And I of course will receive some props here. I already know that. Then I will import React from React as we need to do it. Never forget this. You will get errors otherwise. And I will export this as my default export in this file. Now all that's left in this function is I need to return some JSX, otherwise it's not a valid component. And there, for now, I will return a paragraph where I will say text too short. Of course, this is not conditional at all right now. Maybe already wrap this inside a div here. So let's quickly adjust that. So with that, we got this component set up. Let's now import it in the app.js file by adding an import at the top, where I import validation with a capital D, validation, from the validation folder and there the validation.js file without the file extension in the import. I can now use it here below my input, below the paragraph maybe. I'll add validation as a self-closing tag. Now I also need to pass the text length as a prop though. So here I will simply add a prop and I'll name it input length. The name is up to you. I will add it like this and simply pass this state user input length. Because it is a string, it is an array, therefore I can get the length of the input. And in the validation.js file, I can then use it. Now, That will be part of the third task. I should output text too short or text long enough, depending on the text length. And you can choose any cutoff you want. I'll go with 5 as I suggest here, but that is totally optional. So in there, I'll add a second paragraph. I already got the text too short one, but text long enough, that's missing. And I only want to output one of the two though. Now, there are a couple of ways you can do this. The first way is to use a ternary expression, as I showed you in the previous, or in this module actually, in the previous lectures. So here we could say if props input length, there will be an input length prop because that is what I'm passing here, input length. And this will be the length of, guess what, my input. So if that is, let's say, greater than 5, then I want to output text long enough. Otherwise, I want to output text too short. This should work with this ternary expression. Make sure you save all the files and go back. We already see text too short, and now let me start typing. We see Maximilian. With the next character, it should switch text long enough. And if I remove a character, it goes back to text too short. This works perfectly fine, but what did I tell you about ternary expressions? Use them with caution. Now, actually here, it would be perfectly fine to use one. This is a simple to understand JSX block. Still, let's use the better approach. Let's create a new variable, which I'll name validation message, where I by default will say text long enough. However, I will then check if props input length is smaller or equal than 5. So simply let's do the other way around. Then I will set validation message to text too short. And of course, I could not only assign a text to that, I could assign the whole paragraph, JSX. Both actually works here. I will go with the text to mix it up. So down there, I will then add my paragraph. And inside the paragraph, I will simply output validation message. And this is either text long enough or text too short. And again, the paragraph could be part of the variable too. Now let's save this change. And we should get the same behavior as before. And we do. However, this time here, we do this in a bit more elegant way by storing it in a separate variable, hence making it a bit easier to read and understand and maintain. So this is the solution I recommend. Optionally again, don't use text here. Create a JSX element with the paragraph instead. But this is definitely a good solution for task number 3. Now let's move on and let's create another component, the char component, and style it as an inline box with, for example, the styles I suggest here. So I'll create a new folder in the source folder, char, and in there a char.js file. As before, this doesn't need to have a state, so we can simply create a functional component here, creating it as a function. So char is a ES6 arrow function, as we did it many times before. We definitely need to import React as always, because JSX is just React create element. Never forget this. And then I will export char as the default in this file. Now in there, I now need to return some JSX, and I will actually return a div element wrapping everything. Now for styling it, we got two options. We can set up a CSS file, import it, define a class in there and assign it here, or define inline styles. I'll go for the inline styles here, but it's totally up to you. So let me name this constant style. The name doesn't matter though. And now let me set up what I defined here. So I will set the display to inline block. I will set the padding to 16 pixels. And I will set the margin to 16 pixels. I will set a border of 1 pixel solid and black. What else did I have here? Text align to center, maybe to center everything nicely. So text align to center, this might not even be needed, to be honest. And it won't work like this. Should be camel case because we're in JavaScript. Now I can assign this here dynamically with single quotation marks. So now referring to that style constant. Now we got this component prepared, and we can also import it in the app file where I want to use it. So import char from /char, and there the char.js file without the file extension. But of course we're not using it yet. We want to use it here. We're getting warned that we're not using it actually. We want to use it here to render a list for each character in the text the user entered. So let's do that. I will render this list below the validation here. And I could now use this map method right here. But for the same reason, I restructured the validation and pulled the logic outside of the JSX block I returned. I'll do it here. Here I simply want to render a variable which I prepare prior to this return statement. So there I will simply name this variable char list, for example. And char list, this can be a constant, I'm never going to change it. Char list should reach out to my state, to the user input, and now call map to, again, map every element in this array into a new element. Now this array of course is just some text, but that basically is an array of strings. So here I will get my single char, and you can of course also name this char whatever you want. And I want to return a JSX representation. So I will return my char component. And I will set a character, and this name is also up to you, prop on it, and pass the character I got here, and again this could be named char, whatever you like, into it. So now I need to expect this character component, property inside my char component. So there I will receive props, and I will now simply output props character inside the return statement there. And in app.js, I simply create my list by converting this array. Keep in mind, map doesn't touch the original array. It simply gives you a new array which is stored in char list, a new array of char components. Now let's take that char list constant, and this is what I want to output between single curly braces down there below the validation message. Make sure all files are saved. Now here we're facing the issue that we can't use map. The reason for this is that string are basically or kind of JavaScript arrays, but not really. To turn them into JavaScript arrays, all I have to do is call split on it though, on the user input, and pass an empty string as an argument. This will basically split this into an array of strings after every character. So now this should work. If I enter test here, you can see I get test down there. Now what you also see is that I get this key error. So to fix this, we should of course assign a key. And here the thing with the key is a bit tricky because of that unique ID, which we don't really have in our example. So what I will do is here on the char, I will indeed use the index, though this is not optimal. Better than no key though, but not the best solution. But here I got no other chance, so let's use that second argument of the function inside the map method, the index. With that, if we now reload the page, this works without errors. Now we're almost done. Now we want to make sure that if I click one of these boxes, we remove that character. Now for that, I'll add a new method in my app component. I'll name it delete char handler. And there I basically expect to get the index of the character I want to delete. And I want to execute this obviously whenever I click on one of these character boxes. So I'll split this over multiple lines and then pass a property which I'll name clicked, where I then want to execute this delete char handler, pass the index though, and therefore execute this as an anonymous ES6 function using this alternate syntax of passing a reference. Keep in mind, this anonymous function is basically passed to clicked. It's not executed immediately. This would be the case if I had more parentheses at the end. But here we simply pass a reference, and then this function will get executed when clicked property is fired, and then we call delete char handler. So let's pass the clicked property to char, and there on the div, I'll add the onClick handler and simply pass a reference to props clicked, so that this will be executed, and hence this function here will get executed if I click a box, and then we will get this index. Now inside delete char handler, I get this index. I now want to update the user input, which as you learned is only kind of a JavaScript string. So what I will simply do here is, I will first of all get my text by reaching out to this state user input and calling split on an empty string, just as we did before mapping. Now I got an array of characters. And there I now want to remove one with splice at the index position and then only one character. So this removes it from the array. And now I want to create my updated text where I simply use the text. This is an array of characters, keep that in mind, which I now join again with an empty character, so with basically nothing, but it converts my array of characters into text, into a string again. And then I can call this setState, and there I can set user input equal to updated text. This should actually do the trick. This handler should take my text, update it, and do this for whichever char I click on. Let me save this, and let me enter a test text here. Let me add or click this S here. It's removed, and it's also removed from the input and the text we output here. And if I remove a lot of content from there, actually our validation also jumps to too short again. So everything is dynamic, everything works here as it should with conditional rendering and with outputting lists.